Another mass shooting in the United States leaves several people dead at a shopping mall. U.S. President Biden is urging Congress to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, but will anything change? And the political showdown over the U.S. debt ceiling, why Republican senators say they will not take action without spending and budget reforms. We'll discuss what that could mean for the U.S. economy and global markets. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Biden ordered flags to be flown at half-staff after another horrific shooting. This time, families came under fire at an outlet shopping mall outside of Dallas, Texas. Police say the gunman was wearing tactical gear and was armed with an AR-15 style assault weapon. At least 8 people were killed, including children. Already this year, there have been more than 200 mass shootings in the United States, according to Gun Violence Archive. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre called on members of Congress to address the crisis.
Yesterday, the president once again asked Congress to send him a bill banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, ending immunity for manufacturers, requiring safe storage, enacting universal background checks. It's just common sense. It's just common sense. And it's what the American people want. Majority of the American people want.
Okay, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Ann Arbor, Michigan is Gabriel Ehrlich. He is the Director of Research in Quantitative Economics at the University of Michigan. Here in Washington, D.C., Rafael Bernal is a staff writer for the political newspaper The Hill. Also in D.C., Rena Shah is a political analyst and current affairs commentator. And from Decatur, Georgia, Bill Crane is a political analyst and columnist. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Bill Crane, another mass shooting. It happens with sickening regularity here in the United States, this time in Dallas, Texas. As I said, 8 people killed, 7 others injured, and also, inevitably, we hear the renewed calls for gun control legislation after mass shootings of this type. We heard it from President Biden as well this time. If we look at where the American people stand on gun control legislation, there was a Fox News poll that was done which shows that 87% of people support background checks, 77% support a 30-day waiting period, and 81% support 21 as the legal age to own a gun. So clearly from this polling we can see that there is overwhelming support for change as far as guns are concerned. How does one explain the fact that there is no action from politicians?
Well, I would suggest that there are a lot of people, including myself, that would support the entire list that you just put up. But the list didn't include ban on any classification of weapon that are already in the hands of law-abiding gun owners. We had a shooting here in Atlanta last week. The gentleman was, and I use the term gentleman loosely, a Coast Guard veteran who was discharged in January. His mother was with him in a doctor's office where he couldn't get Ativan, an anxiety medication he was seeking that the VA had declined for him. He didn't need an AK-47, unfortunately. He pulled a handgun from on his person, shot and killed 1 woman and seriously critically injured 4 others before fleeing on foot. Thanks to some technology enhancements and upgrades, license plate reading cameras and other technologies, he was in custody within 8 hours without incident and without use of deadly force. But because these crimes are real, as are crimes of violence all over the United States, particularly in urban areas, Americans still feel a need to protect themselves. So close the loophole on private gun shows. Take all the steps and measures you just laid out, including some basic requirements for gun training, and I think you will see change. But every time we have this discussion, we talk about banning assault weapons, high caliber or high ammunition rifles and handguns, and millions of those are owned by completely law-abiding citizens across the United States who purchased them legally and believe if you pass that law, there'll be confiscation.
Bill, we have had an assault weapons ban before in this country. Why is it so difficult to reintroduce that ban?
When we had it 7 years ago, there's a good amount of data that shows this buying spree course, the prices have come down, but the first kind of stock up of semi-automatic weapons occurred during the ban. You could still buy them outside of the United States. You could still buy them at private gun shows. You could still gift or buy them individual sale to individual sale. And that is when the beginning of kind of the lockup of these weapons occurred during the first ban. So I just don't think it's particularly helpful. And secondly, it will not prevent people willing to break the law and outlaws from having those weapons, whether they're brought in from Mexico, our Canadian border, or come in via shipment into any number of ports of harbor all over the United States and put on rail cars and shipped elsewhere.
Irina Shah, if we look at that Fox News poll again, and the significant number of people who want to see some kind of change, I mean, it seems here we have a graphic example of politicians apparently out of sync with their constituents. These are the people who vote for them. Let's look at it another way. I mean, there's a tendency to blame politicians for this, but isn't the problem the voters who actually put them in office? Isn't it time for voters to say, look, this is a major issue. It's a life and death issue in the United States. If you don't take a stand on this, we're not going to vote for you.
There's so much to unpack here when we talk about the Second Amendment in the United States. We are a country that's obsessed with gun ownership because it's baked into our Constitution. And look, I believe there are many responsible gun owners across the country that don't need to suffer the consequences of a few bad actors. But we are in a moment where it's not even a moment anymore. We've been suffering under this epidemic of gun violence for years now. Firearms is the #1 cause of death for children. I'm somebody that grew up in a rural area, West Virginia, where hunting was beloved. I know that there are good people out there who believe in their right to protect themselves, protect their property. That's a very American feeling. But when we see what's happening here with these automatic military-style firearms, which are primarily designed for rapid fire and combat use, these are the ones being linked to some of the deadliest mass shootings in the U.S. just in the past decade. I think we need to have a reasonable, practical discussion, not just with federal level lawmakers, but with state level lawmakers. To date, only 10 states have laws restricting assault weapons. Now, this shooting at a Texas mall, if this individual did not have that assault style firearm, could he have done what he did? Extinguish the lives of these 8 or 9 people, and I'm sorry, I don't even know the number. This is so disgusting that week after week we have to learn of a new city and learn more numbers of lives lost senselessly because madmen are taking up firearms because they believe it's their right to go out there and get rid of whoever they want. So our lawmakers, of course, at the federal level, the Republicans don't want to act because they want to stand up for these responsible gun owners. And again, they want to hide behind the Second Amendment. And to that I say, I don't think the Founding Fathers ever wanted these type of weapons in the hands of the regular everyday citizen. There's a big difference being able to protect yourself, your family, and your property, and having access to a weapon that can eliminate multiple lives in sheer seconds. So I look forward to the day that Republicans will find their conscience and their courage to act, because millennials like me, Gen Z, we are furious. It's systemic problems that keep these incumbents in office and make it possible for them to not act when tragedy after tragedy happens every few days here in these United States related to guns.
Rafael, Rena points to the fact that if this particular individual, he's been identified as a 33-year-old man, if he didn't have access to this kind of weapon, an assault rifle, could he have done the kind of damage that he did with any other kind of weapon? We don't know that, of course, but there was one really big, bright red flag. This was an individual who was in the military. He was discharged. He was asked to leave the military because of mental concerns. I mean, shouldn't something have been done about that? I mean, do you expect there to be any kind of change after this?
Well, there's going to be the kind of pressure that you always see after one of these horrific incidents. Rena mentioned an epidemic. I would suggest that we're living more in an era, a historical era, since '96 in Columbine. These incidents have become more and more common. And the policy prescriptions, you're right, they might go through firearms firearms legislation. They might go through mental health legislation. But the reality is that most legislators at local and federal levels are constrained from exploring the policy possibilities, especially on the gun side. Partially also on the health side for other structural reasons also unique to this country. But mostly on the gun side, there is the reality that the firearms lobby is very powerful, that politicians, the way politicians are elected in this country now is more about appealing to their respective bases in both parties than it is about appealing to policy prescriptions or to a general electorate, to sort of the center. They're voting for the fringe, really. So all of these things put together put the United States in a very unique situation, and frankly, there are enough firearms, not just in the United States, in the whole continent. They've spilled over. Mexico was mentioned earlier. Yeah. They have definitely spilled over into Mexico, and the violence of access, plus the healthcare problems that we have, plus the drug trafficking issue that is also continental, is causing this era of horrific violence. And legislators just don't seem to have an answer within reach.
And Rafael, very quickly, when you say politicians are constrained, they're constrained, as you point out, by the gun lobby. So does the gun lobby have a louder voice than the people who actually vote for these politicians?
That's a good question. The voices expressed by lobbies are usually expressed behind closed doors. So the real answer is we don't know. It's one of many unknowables, but it is part of it's a symptom of politicians having to respond to their base. Right. And in this case, the gun lobby is very aligned with specifically the Republican base.
Gabriel Ehrlich, great to have you with us on the show. Welcome. I want to turn now to one of the other big political issues here in Washington, D.C., and that is the debt limit. The Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, said the United States could default on its loans by June the 1st. That's not far away if that ceiling is not raised. Let's listen to some of what she had to say.
Since 1960, the debt ceiling has been raised 78 times, 3 times during the prior administration, always with bipartisan support. And it simply is unacceptable for Congress to threaten economic calamity for American households and the global financial system as the cost of raising the debt ceiling and getting agreement on budget priorities.
So, Gabriel, as the Treasury Secretary said there, 78 times. So we have been here before, but if there is a default, what kind of impact is that going to have on the U.S. economy, not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy?
Well, as you say, we have been here before, but we haven't actually gone over to the other side of the debt ceiling before. And so I really think, anybody who says they know what effect it would have is bluffing or really telling a fib, because I don't think there's any way to know what the effect would be. But one thing that I like to tell people is not to think of a debt ceiling breach as a binary event. A lot would depend on the details of what the Treasury does if we go over the debt ceiling, how long the impasse lasts. I think that, if we had a very short-term breach of the debt ceiling with payments, being delayed by a short amount of time and potentially a legal fiction that there hadn't been a default, I think that would have a very different impact than if an impasse stretches on for days or weeks or even as we get into months. I think, if we have a long-lasting breach of the debt ceiling, it would be very difficult to avoid a recession at that point.
Well, as you say, Gabriel, we've never gone into a default situation because, you normally see a lot of political posturing on both sides, and then there is some kind of bipartisan agreement that raises the debt ceiling. If we look at another debate that's going on right now, and that is, should the United States have a debt ceiling? Is it necessary? Because there are some who say, no, we don't need this.
Well, I think the reason some people say we don't need a debt ceiling is because the Congress has already authorized all of the spending that the Treasury would be doing under the debt ceiling. So in some sense, the debt ceiling is, a completely separate cap on borrowing, but it's for money that Congress has already authorized the government to spend.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's duplicative. But there are other people who say, well, it gives the out-of-party power a leverage point to have input into spending decisions. So that's above my pay grade to decide. But I certainly can see both sides of that argument.
Yeah, of course, and we're seeing it right now.
We didn't hit $1 trillion in deficit until Ronald Reagan was president in October of 1981. In the 40 years since, we've raised that deficit to $38 trillion. The U.S. economy is vibrant and growing, and our dollar is the reserve currency of the world. You don't have to look very far to see Saudi Arabia getting close to China, Russia rebuilding its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, to envision a circumstance where the United States dollar is not the reserve currency of choice for the globe, and then people stop wanting to purchase our debt. We do pay the debtors first. The bonds and the interest on those get paid before we pay federal government employees. We've had several shutdowns in the past, and starting with non-essential employees, federal agencies are paused and their work is held up, and then they are repaid later. That may happen again, but do acknowledge that the House Republicans did put a bill in front of the White House that would make $4.75 trillion in cuts. But it really comes out of three buckets. One is claw back unspent spending from the COVID relief acts of the Biden and Trump administration. The second is roll spending levels back to 2021. Those are not huge, painful bills to swallow, and they did not touch Social Security and Medicare, our two largest drivers of spending in the budget.
Rena, looking at the situation right now, there are talks that are scheduled between the White House and congressional leaders. Those talks taking place on Tuesday. What do you expect to come out of that?
Well, it's hard to tell at this moment because the reason these talks are happening are purely because Speaker McCarthy wants to hold the power for as long as he can. Mitch McConnell is sort of wiping his hands clean of this. Look, he has a long history with Joe Biden, McConnell does, but what McConnell, I think, sees at play here is McCarthy doing what he's doing in this very moment regarding this whole spending fight. Because McCarthy is being held hostage by the clown car caucus of the House GOP. These are not real fiscal conservatives. I want to be very clear about that. These are extremist Republicans who want to demonize the Democrats. They want to make the Democrats look bad ahead of 2024 because what they know is that they are losing younger women like me in the suburbs. They are going to have a hard time, and I mean the Republicans, they're going to have a hard time picking up independent voters in swing states as 2024 approaches. So they are panicking. These extremist far-right Republicans want McCarthy to do their bidding, and they want to make Democrats look bad. That's all there is to it. As Janet Yellen said, the debt ceiling was raised 3 times under Trump. This is something both parties have done. Very clear distinction I want to make here, and this is sort of in response to my fellow panelist here, is that, for example, what the Republicans in Congress are proposing right now is spending cuts. They pretty much likely throw the economy into a deep hole, which in the short run looks really good for Republicans and could help them win in 2024. But the consequences of that are really devastating. They're not looking out at the long term. They're being very short-sighted, and it's certainly not looking at the best interests of U.S. small businesses and taxpayers like you and me. So I want to be very clear here that these moves right now are purely political by Republicans in the House, and McCarthy's doing it for his extreme clown car caucus in the House. But this could really backfire on Republicans. They're not keeping that in account right now.
Okay, Gabriel, I want to talk about the presidential race in just a moment, but first, a brief response from you on something else. Another economic issue, and that's interest rates. We had the Federal Reserve, which has raised interest rates again, but it doesn't seem to be cooling the economy. I mean, we just had employment figures come out. Employment's gone up again. So, the White House talks about a target of 2%. I mean, we're very far away from that, aren't we?
So, the Federal Reserve targets inflation at 2%, and it's been very clear that it remains committed to that target. I think that the markets and economists should take the Fed at its word that it is committed to getting inflation back down to 2%. I do expect the Fed to be successful. I would disagree that we're not seeing any cooling in the economy. Clearly, the jobs numbers are still strong. The economy is still overheated, but it's less overheated than it was in the recent past. And, you do see the job gains slowing down if you look over a certain amount of time. And the other thing to say is obviously we're seeing now stress in the banking sector. That's clearly not how the Fed would prefer for its monetary policy to get traction on the real economy. But I do expect that to feed into lending and borrowing decisions. I do expect credit to be tighter as we move forward. So I do think that the Fed's interest rate hikes have been having an effect on the economy, maybe not exactly in the way that economists would have expected.
Right.
But I do expect inflation to come down. I will say I've expected that before, and it's proven to be more stubborn than I've expected, than the Fed has expected. But I do think we're starting to see the Fed's tighter monetary policy starting to have the desired effect of cooling off the economy.
And now I'm trying to be mindful that on these employment numbers, part of what you're also seeing is entry-level job turnover. People are not holding jobs. They're getting hired. They're working 3 or 4 months in training, and then they're quitting. And then they get hired again. So it's not necessarily new employees coming into the workforce,
Right.
as it is a lot of Gen Z and X and millennial employees coming in and not staying, and then going to a job.
All right, Bill, I'm going to stay with you. I want to start talking about presidential politics right now, the race for 2024. The former United States Senator Joe Lieberman, he spoke to my colleague Mike Walter about the 2024 presidential race. This is what former Senator Lieberman said about Joe Biden's arguments for a second term. Let's listen.
Listening to President Biden, his arguments were that he's made some progress. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was a lot more than that, maybe too much more in my opinion, but certainly helped our economy out of the pandemic drop, and also, to me, most significantly, really did more than I think than anything we've done in quite a while here in the U.S. to combat climate change. He'll also talk about other leadership, particularly domestic, although I hope some of the foreign policy will there. Essentially, he'll ask to be given a chance for a second term to finish the job. The other part of the Biden campaign, as we could already hear as it begins, is his contention that democracy, the rule of law, is being challenged here, and that's really a way of saying that the most significant challenges President Biden sees to our democracy and the rule of law come from President Trump.
So, Bill, there we have Senator Lieberman talking about the arguments that Joe Biden is making for a second term. Are those the sort of arguments that's going to resonate with American voters?
Well, it was somewhat helpful during the 2022 midterms for the Democratic Party's messaging to be around the right to vote and restrictions on freedom, issues like Roe versus Wade. It certainly played for them and caused them to either narrowly lose or not lose some races. I do not know that a repeat of the 2020 election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is going to be good for either party. And I sure missed centrist candidates like Joe Lieberman, who ran as a vice presidential nominee as a Democrat in 2020. His son ran for the U.S. Senate here in Georgia. This last cycle didn't do very well.
Rafael, if we look at the latest polling, it's not good news for Joe Biden. According to the Washington Post ABC News poll, that's been getting a lot of attention this weekend, 58% of Democrat-leaning adults say the party needs someone else besides Joe Biden. Biden's approval rating is now at 36%. And if we look at a matchup between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, or Joe Biden and the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, it shows he loses in both those instances. I mean, based on those numbers, are the Democrats in trouble?
I wouldn't say so. I don't think either party is in an enviable position ahead of this election. One or both of the parties are more likely than not to have a nominee that they didn't really want there. And that nominee will either be President Biden or former President Trump, or both of them. It's very likely that we do see broad strokes of a repeat of the 2020 election. Certain factors could change the result. A big recession would likely wipe out the Democrats, and they know it, and the Republicans know it. Their management of the border will definitely determine a lot. And fear of losing democracy is really sort of the character trait side of if former President Trump does become the Republican nominee. And that's what could push a lot of people to Biden the same way it did in 2020. He wasn't ever the candidate people were clamoring for. He was just the candidate who could beat Trump.
Rena, Senator Lieberman also shared his thoughts on former President Donald Trump. Let's listen to what he said.
It certainly appears that Donald Trump is by far the most popular candidate among Republican voters. So I would say right now, barring surprises, he's likely to be the Republican nominee. But I think myself, and I know a lot of my Republican friends feel this way, he's not the strongest Republican candidate for president in the general election, because a lot of people who are not Democrats but are independent voters in America have turned off on him. Even some of those many who voted for him when he first ran in 2016 because of his refusal to give up on how the 2020 election turned out, and of course their association of him with the riot at the Capitol of the United States on January 6th.
Serena, I've only got a minute, but it would look like at both ends of the political spectrum, the choices at this stage are not very popular. I mean, is Trump electable?
Certainly, I think Trump has a lot of issues that make him unelectable, but it's all about what the Republican Party is going to do when we get closer to these primaries. Are they going to remain to have this group called the After Trumpers grow bigger in size? We got the empirical data that told us that they are growing in size. We got that this past November. So look, it's not the MAGA faction that has the power anymore. And that's really what it comes down to. Nobody can predict at this point who's going to be the one to peel off Trump out of the GOP primary. But all I've got to say is we've still got a long ways to go. And whatever candidate right now is plotting their run is plotting for a marathon, not a sprint. And in my estimation, Governor Ron DeSantis has the best chance, because what the Republican Party seems to want, if anything at all, is Trump light.
Gabriel, very quickly, I've only got about 20 seconds. The economy is often cited as the most important thing for voters. I mean, what do you expect in the year ahead?
So, first, I have to say I disagreed with some of Bill's comments about the strength of the labor market. Those jobs numbers are net numbers. They account for people losing jobs, leaving jobs, and getting jobs. It's a very strong labor market. We do expect a mild recession as our baseline scenario at the end of this year, early next year, but I wouldn't be shocked if the economy avoids a recession. If we do have a recession, I would expect it to be very mild from a historical perspective.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.